past 2 months, we've been following a cycle of stories telling the saga of David, the second king of Israel. If I'm feeling diplomatic, I will describe him as a complicated figure. If I am being honest, I will admit that he is my least favorite figure in the entire Bible, and today's story is one of the reasons why. At the beginning of the cycle, the tribes of Israel asked for a king to bring them together into a united nation. The prophet Samuel tells them in no uncertain terms that a king will take their sons and send them to war, that a king will take their daughters to his palace, that a king will take the best of their fields and their animals and their harvests and their labors. The people will regret that they asked for a king. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, Samuel says. Nevertheless, Saul is crowned king. Then Saul disappoints his people and betrays their trust. Nevertheless, David takes the throne after Saul. And then David, too, disappoints his people and betrays their trust. We are determined to have a king, the people had said, so that he may govern us and go out before us and fight our battles. They do not receive what they asked for, not in Saul and not in David. To be somewhat fair to Saul and David, and I suppose all humankind, humans are complicated, and they could never have been perfect leaders who never disappointed anyone ever, because that is literally impossible. It is possible for the same person to commit terrible things and also have impressive achievements that benefit others. It is a hard thing to balance the legacy of such figures, because as much as we might want to celebrate the good they did, we cannot brush the bad under the rug. No one is perfect, and every single figure in the Bible, other than Jesus, is a flawed and sinful person, like we are. The story of David was not written down so that we could beatify him and place him on a pedestal and regard him as a superhero who could do no wrong. The story of David was written down because he played a central role in the events that created and shaped and destroyed the kingdom of Israel, for better or for worse. The moral of David's story is not try to be like David. The moral of David's story is to learn from his mistakes and try to do better, and to be willing to face and name and discuss hard and painful things. David was a poet and a military strategist and a charismatic politician. He was also a rapist and a murderer. Our second reading this morning comes to us from the second book of Samuel, chapter 11, verses 1 through 15. Hear now the word of the Lord. In the spring of that year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. It happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. David sent someone to inquire about the woman. It was reported, "This is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite." So David sent messengers to fetch her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she had been purifying herself after her period. Then she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David, "I am pregnant." So David sent word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab and the people fared and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. When they told David, Uriah did not go down to his house. David said to Uriah, "You have just come from a journey. Why did you not go down to your house?" But Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah remain in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do such a thing." Then David said to Uriah, "Remain here today also, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day. On the next day, David invited him to eat and drink in his presence and made him drunk. And in the evening he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of his lord, but he did not go down to his house. So in the morning David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. In the letter he wrote, "Set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, so that he may be struck down and die." This is the word of the Lord. This is the word of the Lord, but there is no good news in this story. The opening lines are an ominous beginning. It is spring. Spring should be a time of planting and growing and watching over lambs and calves, but instead, we are told that spring is the time when kings go to battle. In David's kingdom, war has become routine. Samuel had warned the people of the last generation that a king would take their sons and send them to war, and David has done exactly that. Samuel had warned the people of the last generation that a king would take their daughters to his palace, and David has done exactly that with at least 7 wives already. The people had told Samuel that they wanted a king to govern them and go before them and fight their battles. But David has remained in Jerusalem and sent others to fight his battles for him. David first entered the narrative as a young and unimportant shepherd boy, brushed off and disregarded even by his brothers and his father. Now he has wealth and power and influence beyond what he ever could have dreamed of. But he abuses his wealth and power and influence and uses them to abuse the people he has sworn to govern and protect. Today's story is often presented in art and film and even within the church as some kind of love story at best, or more often as a story of 2 people committing adultery together, perhaps because Bathsheba seduced the king. Any of those stories would be easier to hear and easier to have as part of our history, but the text itself does not present any evidence of a love story or of adultery or of seduction. Our New Revised Standard Version Bible here softens things as much as it linguistically can, saying that David sent messengers to fetch her and that she came to him. But the original phrasing in Hebrew is more like David sent messengers and took her and had sex with her. Except that because of course this line needs to get worse, the verb took can also be used to mean bought or captured or taken by force. There is no invitation for Bathsheba to accept or decline. There is no room for her to say anything at all. She has no choice. The only action she takes of her own volition is to ritually wash herself after having her period. I shouldn't have to say that that isn't an act of seduction. She was taken from her home and sent back when David was done with her. If she hadn't fallen pregnant, that might have been the end of the chapter as far as David was concerned. But instead, we watch on in growing horror as David first tries to pass off his child as that of another man, and then has that man killed so that he can't complain. It is only at that moment that our narrator tells us how Bathsheba felt about any of this. When the wife of Uriah heard that her husband was dead, she made lamentation for him. Until this point in the narrative, David has been the hero and has been rightfully celebrated by the people as a man after God's own heart. He has worshiped God and made decisions based on what would be best for all Israel, not just his own tribe. It would be easier to close the curtains on his story before the point where we came in today. Because believe it or not, the story gets worse. The atrocities that David commits become examples for his sons. They see how their father treats his subjects as objects to be used and thrown away. And their behavior towards each other and the people of Israel is so awful that it rips the kingdom into two separate nations. David is not a forgettable side character. He is remembered as one of the most famous and heroic and good kings in history or legend. And yet, the terrible things he did were written down to be remembered thousands of years later. Because the point of David is not that we should try to be like him or try to find a king to follow in his footsteps. The point is that no one should have that much unchecked power. The point is that we can't regard any human figure as an idol to be worshipped. The point is that we need to talk about the shameful chapters of our history, because if we don't, how can we possibly face the shameful things that happen around us and within us every day? If we excuse David's actions or blame them on Bathsheba, then we are contributing to the fog of shame and secrecy that makes it so that 2 out of 3 sexual assaults won't even be reported in our country today. It can be hard to see the point when only 6% of rapists ever see the inside of prison. I know Bathsheba. I've stood on her roof, and it is such a crowded place that there's no air left to breathe. She deserved justice, and even though she couldn't find it in her own society, we can work to change ours. King David is my least favorite figure in the Bible, but I think that his story and the story of his fall from grace is one of the most important stories for us to study and remember. Because when he got comfortable and took his privileges for granted, his concerns turned inward to himself alone and not to those around him. But his acts of sin affected far more people than just Bathsheba and Uriah. His acts of sin and the example he set radiated through his children and his children's children until everything fell apart. There is no good news in this story. But there is a challenge passed down through countless hundreds of generations to face the ugly truth of David's abuse of power and to sit with the discomforting history of what can happen when power goes unchecked. There is a challenge to remember what God asks of us, to seek justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with our God. There is a challenge to hold the Davids of our world responsible. There is a challenge not to be like David, but to learn from David's failings how to be better than he turned out to be.